welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show. Liked, commented, did the social media stuff. Very, very much appreciated. If you're a new viewer to the channel, very, very pleased to have you on board. Please subscribe, that would be really cool. If you've been around for a while, as per usual, yeah, good stuff. Anyway, last week's episode of the show seemed to go down well, which was really good. I think I've caught up with everybody's comments and what have you, so thank you for those. This week, it's a slight change of direction with that certain time of the year fast approaching. Sales of French spirits do tend to increase. It's a bit of a shame that people just seem to associate cognac and Armagnac with the festive period rather than sort of thinking of it as a sort of like an all year round drink. I mean, there are obviously people that do, but obviously, as we well know, so many people just get into the tradition of Christmas, the big meal, the sort of like, you know, falling asleep in front of the King's Speech nowadays, isn't it? And a glass of cognac in hand, you know. So had a lovely email from Freddie from Bunch and Bushel, who are the distributors for Grand Champagne, Hermitage cognacs, in Grand Champagne cognacs. They're also distributors for Chortin Calvados, who I did an episode of the show on not so long ago, and they're also the distributors for an Armagnac producer called Delord, and they basically Freddie sent me an email saying, "Do you fancy some samples for you know, an episode of the show?" And sort of the list, you know, sort of cognacs dating back to sort of like, you know, the turn of the century and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I was really going to get samples of those. Although in saying that, I have got a sample of quite an old cognac, so you never know if I can persuade them to sort of crack open a sort of like a several £1,000 bottle of cognac. Anyway. No, what I thought would be nice is to have a look at the Delord range. I don't know Delord at all as an Armagnac producer, so this was a sort of like, you know, nice to take a look at some another Armagnac producer. I don't get the opportunity very often to look at cognac and Armagnac producers because putting one's sort of sales hat on, and of course any comments that I do make today have no relevance to the company that employs me, but you know, when I have we have a kind of like a fairly set in stone selection of cognacs and Armagnacs, and we've had them for certainly that some of them have predated my time at the company, and they're popular, and you know, there's very little room to sort of add new cognac and Armagnac producers. I have done so over the years, and they've never really sort of stuck around. So I don't get the opportunity to taste these different producers very, very often. So a big thank you to Freddie from Bunch and Bushel for the samples for today's episode of the show. So a bit of history. Basically, Delord can trace their history back to 1893 when a chap called Prosper Delord didn't exactly set the company up, but he was a distiller and cellar master, and apparently had a travelling still, shall we say, and would you know, go around the region and no doubt offer his services to those cognac and Armagnac producers that sort of didn't actually have the setup. And that's not unusual. Well, it's less usual today, shall we say. I mean, this kind of thing sort of certainly happened in the sort of like the 1800s, and it carries on today to a certain extent, more so with regards to bottling. There's mobile bottling plants. A lot of growers don't have the ability to sort of bottle their own wine. I mean, unless you're maybe a very, very small producer, you can sort of do it in the corner of the cellar maybe, but you get a lot of these sort of mobile bottling units going around France doing that kind of thing, as well as, you know, other things as well. But anyway, so the story dates back to, or the Delord story dates back to 1893. It wasn't until 1932 that one of his sons, Gaston and Georges, started the Armagnac house of Delord. And they became sort of not only sort of producers but traders and that kind of thing. And the property has been handed down throughout sort of like the family. And the current owners are two chaps called Sylvain and Jerome. One does the sales, and I think that's Jacques that does the sales, but the blender is, I think, Sylvain. I could have that the wrong way around, but that was the inference that I got from the limited amount of information on their website. Now, not a particularly huge producer. They have one vineyard of 45 hectares, which is divided apparently into 11 different parcels, located in the village of Alambics, and it is made up of the traditional 4 grape varieties of Armagnac. They grow 58% Uni Blanc, 16% Colombard, 14% Fol Blanche, and 12% Bacco. I believe that the sort of powers that be in the sort of the AOC of Armagnac want to basically sort of get Bacco out of the equation, because it's a hybrid grape variety, and they probably, but to me that's I mean, I've been to Armagnac, I have blended Armagnac, I have blended Armagnac with far too much Bacco in, and my god is it foxy, but it adds the character. That's what it's all about, you know. It's what differentiates Armagnac from cognac, apart from obviously the style of distillation and what have you, but it's, to me, one of the great selling points of Armagnac is the use of this particular sort of grape variety, and like I said, you have to handle the damn thing careful, because if you put too much in, you get too much of a funky Armagnac, and you don't want that, do you? Anyway, so each of the I mean, this is one of the things about sort of cognac and Armagnac producers that I'm in awe of, is that not only do you have to be a skilled distiller, you also have to be a skilled winemaker as well. Now, I know that most sort of cognac and Armagnac producers will have a vineyard manager, and they will have somebody that makes the wine, and then they will have a separate distiller, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them are all sort of interchangeable. The sort of the maitre d'chet will basically not only sort of look after the distilling, but he will keep an eye on the winemaking as well, because at the end of the day, you don't want crap wine to sort of, you know, and not that, you know, Colombard and Fol Blanche and what have you make the world's greatest of wines, which is why they distill it anyway, but you know, we won't go down that path. Anyway, so back to Delord. So yes, each of the 4 varieties harvested and sort of vinified separately, and yeah, it is Sylvain that sort of looks after the process, and the distillery is quite interesting. As you know, most Armagnac is distilled on archaic sort of column stills. I mean, I remember, and I probably said it before, going to visit Sagognac in Armagnac, and I mean, Sagognac is one of the larger producers, but his still room was minuscule, minute, just one relatively small, battered and what's the word, sort of, yeah, battered column still. But the interesting thing about Delord is that they don't just have the sort of traditional Armagnac column still. They also have a pair of well, they have a pair of Armagnac Alambics, which date from the 1900s, but they also have 2 pot stills as well. Don't think it says exactly what style they are, but I would guess they're probably going to be Charentais stills, and so it kind of gives them a bit of flexibility. Maybe they're sort of like, you know, are not quite so traditional Armagnac styles. Maybe they blend in the 2 different types of spirit. Maybe, I don't know, is the honest answer. Probably didn't ask enough questions of Bunch and Bushel, but anyway, so traditional cellars, they have around about 1,000 barrels, which date back to quite, well, considering that they have vintage dated Armagnac going back quite some time. Although in saying that, like a lot of the cognac and Armagnac producers, their very, very old spirit is no longer in cask. It's held in sort of glass demijohns, essentially called bonbons. And again, I remember going to visit Sabram, and they have part of the cellar kind of like almost kind of walled off to a certain extent, and you sort of peer through the sort of dusty glass at these bonbons sat on the floor, because you know they hold some of, you know, some spirit that's silly aged, and yeah, you know, that's worth an arm and a leg. And you know, that's the thing about cognacs and Armagnacs, and my biggest criticism is that criticism is kind of the fact that sort of both Armagnac and cognac to a certain extent is too welded to tradition and history and the 40% ABV, which all today's spirits are. It's like, come on, you know, we're in the 21st century now. You should be thinking about sort of the fact that cognacs, Armagnacs, luxury brand, luxury drink, really should be thinking at 43%, if not 46% non-chill filtration, certainly no colouring. Not that I'm saying any of today's Armagnacs are coloured, but you know, I mean, I complain about the whiskey industry being sort of like a bit of a, you know, a behemoth, and you know, with its head stuck in the past. The French brandy industry is probably even worse. I mean, and yet, you know, they go mon tradition, all words to that effect. And no, I won't try doing a French accent again, because I'll probably just I've just insulted the entirety of Gascony, and so I'll just rub it in by doing a bad impression of their accent. But anyway, no, I don't think there's an awful lot else to say, to be fair. Like I said, this is they're a relatively small producer. I've not tasted them before, so really quite looking forward to this. So let's have a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so as I said, all of today's bottlings are bottled at 40%. We're going to kick off with their entry-level cognac, the 15-year-old. I mean, why not? I mean, you know, none of this sort of like, you know, we just whack together a quick 3-year-old and call it a VS and punt it out. Nope. Entry level is, well, certainly entry level in the UK. I don't know about sort of the rest of their range, is 15 years old. Good. Next bottling is their 20-year-old. So again, 40%. And then we'll move on to their 25-year-old, again 40%. Now, as you know, Armagnac producers tend to bottle a lot of vintage dated Armagnacs. It's kind of, to a certain extent, their sales pitch, I suppose. I mean, you know, cognac is always considered the god of French brandy, and Armagnac tends to be in its shadow somewhat, which I think is you know, wrong, but you know, that is the general perception. So a lot of the Armagnac producers are quite sort of canny about this, and will basically jump through all the hoops and the red tape and all that kind of stuff, and bottle vintage dated Armagnacs. And some of them will have, you know, Armagnacs in bottle dating back to, well, 1900s. I mean, probably beyond that, I imagine, although can't imagine there's very many of those bottles knocking about on the market at the moment. But certainly looking at some lists, they have, you know, some of the producers have a quite extensive back catalogue. So, you know, that tends to be their kind of selling point. You know, you have an anniversary or sort of like a birthday or something like that, you can probably pick up an Armagnac from that particular vintage. I wouldn't say relatively easy, but relatively easy, shall we say. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to look at two of the Delord vintages. This is the 2002. Now, one thing I do like about what Delord do is they put the bottling date on the label. A lot of Armagnac producers and cognac producers don't do that, so you have absolutely no idea exactly how old the juice in the bottle is. I mean, doesn't really matter too much if you're buying a sort of like, you know, a 1950s or you know, Armagnac or cognac, you know, but it's a nice touch, so you know exactly how old and when it was bottled. So this is a 2002. It's actually 17 years old because it was bottled in 2019. And like I said, even if going back to the whole ABV thing, you know, not wishing to sound like a stuck record, but if you're going to sort of like, okay, yeah, you want your sort of like your core range to be 40%, at least bottle the vintages at sort of, you know, either 43, 46% or even natural cask strength. You know, there are a few that do that, but they're very few and far between. It just adds to the cachet, I think. And you know, when the importers or stockists may well say, well, it's going to whack the price up. It's bloody expensive to start off with. What's a few more quid added on top of 100 and something odd pound bottle of cognac, you know, or Armagnac? Don't buy that one. Anyway, so yeah, like I said, so that's the first of the two vintage ones. That's the 2002, which is 17 years old. And the final bottling is the 1993 dated Armagnac. It is 27 years old because it was bottled in 2020. So interesting lineup. Going to see if there's a great deal of variation between the age statements as they're fairly close together, you know, 15, 20 and 25 years, but we shall see. So I think this is going to be quite interesting, so we'll kick off with the 15-year-old. Right, okay, so let's kick off with the 15-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Dense, quite dark, baked apple, oxidised apple, touch of spice. My main impression is it's very polished. It's kind of too polished. I know, bear with me here, it does sound a bit of a stupid thing to say that a spirit can be too polished, but part of the appeal of Armagnac is the slight rusticity, that slight bite, and I'm guessing that using double pot stills, they have kind of produced this slightly less rustic style of spirit, and it's very soft, it's very smooth, and it's very nice, it's pleasant. But I get the feeling it's trying to be too cognac-y. If that makes any sense, you know, I want my Armagnac to have that little bit of rusticity, a little bit of a bite to say, we're not cognac, we're different, you know. And although this is an exceptionally good spirit, it's not the most complex of Armagnacs. It's pleasant, it's deep, it's polished, it's slightly earthy. There's a little bit of almost kind of rye bready sort of spice going on, but distinctly appley. Baked apple, like I said. Let's see what that's like. A bit fresher on the palate. Almost has a sort of Calvados-y kind of feel. I get a lot of fresh apple, almost green apple, but baked apple. Again, polished, subtly spiced, very subtle on the oak. Again, not something you will often find in Armagnac. There's an awful lot of oak character because the casks that tend to be used, Limousin, Tronqués, etc., tend to be sort of pretty well used, and a lot of cellar masters are really not looking for too much over oak in it. They want the sort of the focus to be on the spirit. And again, spirit is good. Good quality, deep, got a little bit of darkness, darker fruit coming through on the finish. Not, again, the most sort of complex of Armagnacs, and again, very polished, lacking that little bit of rusticity, that little bit of bite that, you know, that I personally want. Now, this is, like I said, this is a personal kind of thing. You may well decide that that's what you like about your French spirit. You want the softness, you want the sort of smoothness, and you want the polished character. Me personally, like I said, just want that little bit of rusticity. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 20-year-old. Let's see if what an extra 5 years does to it. A little more maturity, I would say, not a great deal. Again, similarity to the 15. A little bit more oak character actually coming through on this. A little bit more sort of, I'm getting dark marzipan. Again, it's very polished. We can see that this is the obvious style of Delord, and it is very, very polished. Again, a little bit of spice, dark fruits, a little bit of dried grape. There's a slight, almost violety note. Little bit. Is it a little touch fresher than the 15? Yeah, I think it is. A touch fresher, a little bit more oak, a little deeper, but still, for me, just kind of lacks that sort of slight rustic element. Let's see what the powers are. A little more noticeable oak. Certainly it's kind of, impinging is the wrong word, but it's cutting off the finish just a smidgen. But it's got some lovely spiciness on the finish. Again, it's not the most complex. It's a touch darker, a little bit more sort of dark marzipan. Again, oxidized apple, baked apple, touch of grape. I mean, yeah, quality spirit. You cannot argue that the quality of what's in the bottle is pretty good. Like I said, just lacks that little bit of rusticity for me. Right, okay, so on to the 25-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Right, now we're kind of more like the 15. It's got that kind of less oaky nose, yeah. Yeah, it's got that, and that little bit more freshness, which is quite surprising. I was expecting it to sort of show even more maturity, but it's almost kind of sort of stepped back to the sort of style of the 15. Again, polished, appley, dark apple. Not as much oak as the 20-year-old, sorry. Certainly I'm not getting any of that kind of marzipan or sort of vanillins. And yeah, it does. It has, because it has a slightly fresher note to it, it doesn't seem as old as the 20-year-old. Bizarre, isn't it? It's just amazing what sort of, your nose does to or but it doesn't seem quite as old. I mean, yes, there is the maturity there. You can smell that there is a maturity there to the spirit. But like I said, it has maybe a slightly more fresher edge, which kind of makes me, gives it more of a closer affinity to the 15. Anyway, let's see what comes out. Now the palate is more like 20-year-old. Certainly I'm getting the oak character that was noticeable on the 20-year-old. That's definitely noticeable here on the 25-year-old. A little bit deeper, still very soft, very polished, very smooth. Even the spices are kind of polished, if you like. Like I said, there's none of that kind of sort of rusticity, there's none of that bite, that sort of like intensity. It is really, really soft, and like I said, even the spices seem to have a lovely softness to them. So, like I said, it's not my kind of favoured style of Armagnac, but certainly if you like this kind of thing, if you love your sort of like, your Armagnac to be a little bit more polished and a little bit softer, this is certainly one for you. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two vintages. This is the 2002, which is 17 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? Now, I like this. Fresher, crisper. It's got raisinated fruits, dried grape. It's less polished. Quite aromatic, touch of apple, a little bit of oak, a little bit of vanilla, freshness. This is good. This is more like the sort of Armagnac that I like. It's still fairly polished, it has to be said, but there is a little bit more of there is some rusticity. Now, maybe in the younger spirits that they produce, they use more of the traditional Armagnac Alambic distilled spirit and less of the pot still spirit, possibly. There's definitely a sort of, there is a rusticity to this. This is more like what I want from my Armagnacs. It's not, you know, a total rustic spirit. It's got the element of rusticity, and it adds character. It adds complexity. I love the freshness of this. This is a lovely nose, and I much prefer this to any of the core range. Let's see what the pass on. Again, it has that element of rusticity, it has that spiciness, that sort of edge. Okay, the finish is medium-ish. There's quite a bit of wood and wood spice, along with the sort of bacco-y kind of foxiness as well coming through right on the finish. I mean, it is perfectly encapsulates what I want about an Armagnac. It has complexity, it has elegance to a certain extent, but it has the rusticity, it has the spiciness, the edge that says we're not cognac, we are a little bit more down and dirty to a certain extent. Yeah, I like that. That's really very, very good. Okay, so let's move on to the 1993. This is 27 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Right, okay, so we're in the style of the core range, but again, I'm getting that sort of spicy element coming through. It's got a bit of edginess, dried apricot, more apricot-y than apple, a little bit of marzipan, dark grape, touch of citrus, really complex. And you know, I'm kind of thinking, I know that all the cognac and Armagnac houses are based upon the blending of various aged spirits to produce the core range. I know, I've done it, I've been there. I've made a lovely VSOP, but used far too much old spirit, and it would have been ridiculously expensive. But I know that that's what they kind of like base themselves upon. It's the sort of, but you know what? In this kind of very, very sort of minuscule kind of look at the Delord range, the vintage date stuff just is so much more interesting. And one could argue that maybe the blending of so much stuff has, I wouldn't say neutralised the end product, because that would be being disingenuous, but it's kind of made it slightly less unique, less interesting, possibly. This is a lovely nose. I mean, it really is absolutely gorgeous. It's got some lovely maturity, the right amount of maturity. It's got some freshness, some edginess, some spice, some oak, touch of cinnamon, bark, dried grape, dried apple. I mean, that's just a lovely nose. I mean, that really is. Now, bottle that 46% and you're just going to be, oh my god, the intensity is off the charts, because at the moment, again, it's soft, it's nice, you know, you know, 46%, this would have been just mind-blowing. It really would have been, I can tell you that. Anyway, let's see what the parts like. Lovely power. Again, it says Armagnac to me. It says rusticity, spice, edginess, but polished as well. It is just lovely, beautifully put together. Again, dark fruit, but it's got this wonderful citric lift. Spicy, greener apple notes on the finish. It's got this just wonderful balance of sort of maturity with an almost kind of youthful freshness, just citric, almost citric freshness kind of coming through right on the finish. Really juicy, really impressive. Just imagine how mouth-watering and sort of succulent that would be at 46%. You know, and this is sort of, I would happily say this to sort of any of the Armagnac or cognac producers. Bottle your stuff at 46%, please. I mean, because, you know, you've got a wonderful spirit which could be even better. And, you know, just forget about convention and tradition and all that kind of stuff, because sometimes history and tradition and all that kind of stuff just gets in the way. You know, you sometimes you just have to basically sort of ignore the noise of history and sort of the, you know, the older generations going, no, we don't do it like that. Oh God, I'm sorry. But you know what I mean, sometimes you just basically have to go, hello, we're in the 21st century now, we need to do things in a 21st century way, to a certain extent. Respect tradition, absolutely, must do that, in, you know, but, you know, just update your product for the modern world is basically what I'm saying. So, you know, and it would just make it so much, for me, so much better. Unlike my French accent, that should we say. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So firstly, big thank you to Freddie from Bunch and Bushel for the samples for today's episode of the show. I mean, I hope at the end of the day that if anyone from Delord actually watches this review, they don't think it's you know, that I'm trashing them. Not at all. I love the range. I think the range is really good. Maybe it's not quite as complex as some Armagnacs I've come across, and like I said, my biggest criticism of the core range was the fact that it was a bit too polished. It was a bit too much like cognac, and thus kind of like you're losing your, to sort of, if I'm going to be modern about this, your USP or whatever it's called, you know, the selling point. The whole point of Armagnac is that it is a slightly more rustic spirit, and thus it should sort of display that rusticity, that edginess within, you know, the sort of confines of sort of like a classy spirit. So, but, you know, that's just me. So I thought the sort of like the core range was kind of interesting. And like I said, I mean, I liked the 15-year-old. It was pleasant enough, had that sort of freshness, which was kind of quite cool. 20-year-old, maybe, I suppose, I don't know whether it's kind of my favourite of the three. It's difficult to say. I mean, it certainly had sort of a little bit more oak going on, maybe a little bit more complexity. The 25 was nice, and it kind of combined the nose of the 15 with the palate of the 20-year-old. Interesting in that respect. But I think the thing is that where it appears that sort of Delord's strong point seems to be its vintage dated bottlings. They just seem to have so much more character. Maybe, like I said, that certainly it felt to me that the younger of the two, the 17-year-old, certainly had maybe more spirit produced on the Armagnac Alambics, as opposed to the sort of like the Charente stills. I'm again assuming Charente stills, because it just seemed more typical of Armagnac. Again, it had the sort of softness that seems to be the sort of like the hallmark of Delord, and certainly I think the 27-year-old, the 93, again just married the 2 points together. Yes, it was more like the core range. It had the sort of the polish and the softness, but there was again a little bit more edginess to it, a little bit more rusticity, a little bit more interest, and a little bit more complexity for my personal taste. Like I said, bottle at 46%, and you know, you've got a damn good spirit. I mean, I'm not saying that it isn't good as it is, but you know, 46% would make that a whole lot more better in my personal opinion. But anyway. Right, so that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. Not quite sure what I'm going to be up to next week. There is a sort of an unusual episode of the show in the pipeline. I don't know whether it will happen next week or the week after, possibly. I don't know, but there is an interesting one kind of coming. Well, I say they're interesting. I think they're all interesting at the end of the day, aren't they? Well, I hope you think so. Anyway, until then, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming. And yes, it is afternoon.